So in this podcast, what we're going to do is take a kind of quick review of the chapter you were assigned to read out of Wright's into Wright's Simply Jesus, the section on the stories that explain and a message that transforms, which is chapter 8. And so a couple of things to highlight here for your attention, draw your attention to. For Wright, what parables are they are about what ought to be happening on earth by those who enter into God's kingdom. And what he does is he uses as an illustration of this point the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. And so in this story, here we have a poor man who is kind of laid at the gate, as it were, of a very wealthy man. The poor man is named Lazarus. This is the only parable that has a character who is named. Because of that, some have thought, well, this isn't really a parable because Jesus doesn't um, name characters in his parables. But the name Lazarus means God's help, and that plays into the story. So I don't think that that's a good enough reason for it not to be considered a parable. And the fact that he is named is also shows that he is honored in the story because naming someone provides honor, whereas the rich man who should receive honor is not named. So, but the rich man in the story gets a burial. He is buried, so he is honored by people, whereas the poor man receives no mention about being buried, but both have died. And then, so in this other world, in the Hadean world, so some translations will render it as hell. That's probably misleading. What's happening here is not that the rich man is in hell. He is in Hades. The Greek word that is used is Hades. And this is this world in which both the good and the bad go. But the good go to paradise, they go to a place of comfort, whereas the wicked, they go to a place of torment in this world. And so hell is the place for final judgment. So our English word hell is usually used to translate the Greek word Gehenna. So uh, Wright draws attention to this parable, and in this parable, he then kind of concludes that the message then remains very much about what ought to be happening here and now on earth, not just in heaven. Because in the parable, the rich man complains that, about his situation and to send Lazarus to warn his brothers. And he is told that his brothers know fine well the law and the prophets are very clear what God expects of people, and he expects them to take care of those who are vulnerable. He expects to take care of the poor, and the wealthy are not doing that, and so they will be held accountable for it. And so they don't need somebody rising from the dead to tell them what they need to be doing. So the parable is not so much about what's going on in that other world, but about how people now ought to live. They ought to live taking care of one another. Parables for Wright are talking about what God is doing at last for Israel. But the wrong people are getting the message. That is, what's happening in the story of Jesus is the people who are responding are not the educated. They are not the religious leaders. They are sinners. These are lawbreakers who are coming to Jesus and responding to his gospel. So the people who aren't responding are the scribes and certain religious teachers and the chief priest. So the people in authority are not responding positively. So from their perspective, the wrong people are getting the message. But God is coming for the wrong people, those who are denied justice, those who are denied an opportunity to prosper, those who are not being led by their leaders to produce fruits of righteousness. So that's the problem that's going on. So what God is also doing is he is kind of mending people and he's making new life happen. So he's doing this great new things that he's always promised for Israel. And So now this mending process is beginning to take place. And parables like the parable of the sower is about these kind of mending processes. So to understand how Jesus' parables work, Wright reminds readers to kind of look at the king's dream in Daniel 2. Now, some of you may not have ever read the book of Daniel, but Daniel is an extremely important work to understand not only the Jesus movement, but also early Christianity. Daniel is a representation of kind of apocalyptic literature. And so, what you have in Daniel are you have these visions, these dreams, and so for Wright, if you kind of take a look at what's going on then in these dreams, you kind of get an idea of what's going on here as well. So in Daniel, the book of Daniel really represents kind of what some scholars will refer to as resistance literature. In other words, this is a literature that resists the narrative that is being provided by the government about who's in charge and the gods wanting them to be in charge and saying, really, ultimately, Yahweh does not want these people to reign. He is permitting them to reign temporarily, but God is at work to bring them down or to vindicate the righteous and to bring punishment to those who have aligned themselves with an evil power. So, of course, in the book of Daniel, the background has to do with Antiochus Epiphanes. And so this resistance literature is intended to help those who face persecution and suffering. So parables for Wright then are something like this type of resistant language. It's providing people a sense of seeing how God's kingdom is at work. The people who Jesus talked to are the people who are suffering under the current conditions of poor leadership from the chief priest and to those who run things in Jerusalem. Poor leadership, obviously, from people like Herod Antipas or from Pilate in Rome. So they are not giving the people what they are supposed to have. They are not the ones that God has anointed to be the everlasting kind of a ruler. And so God's kingdom is coming into this world because these people are not acting with righteousness. And so the parables are supposed to resist the narrative of the government and provide people with the counter narrative of what God is doing through Jesus and through Jesus' ministry. Parables then are about the coming of God's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. So, apocalypse is about this idea. That's what an apocalyptic vision. Jesus is really kind of like an apocalyptic prophet. He has had a vision himself that he is God's son, and he talks about people receiving a vision or having it being revealed that he is the Christ. So in Matthew 16. And so Jesus understands that things are hidden. So parables are oftentimes hidden things. So people from the outside might not be able to understand it, but his disciples, these things have been revealed to them. So they possess this mystery. So this is kind of like with um, visions in Daniel, that they are cryptic. They're not easily understood. Someone has to explain them. And so what we're getting then is this language, just like in Daniel, of God's kingdom coming. So to now with Jesus, God's kingdom is coming so that people can begin to live the life that God had always intended them to live. So the parable of the great wedding party, which is used then on this kind of last section in this chapter, is about being prepared. So it reminds people that you aren't going to be able to come into God's kingdom without being morally transformed. So in this parable, and he uses this story that's found in Matthew 22, a man is found who is invited to the parable, to the wedding, and he's not properly clothed. And so this is kind of understood then as what's required. You've got to be properly dressed. And so the idea of being dressed is symbolic. We see this happening within um, certain traditions and behaviors within the Jewish world, where certain clothing can reflect a certain kind of reality. So, for instance, at if a person is receives a white garment, that white garment reflects the kind of purity that they are supposed to be emulating. And so this person is supposed to have on the wedding garment that's appropriate. And so too, with God's kingdom, there's a certain kind of morality that people have and able to enter into it. So um, the parable of the wedding party then is to remind people to get properly dressed, to be transformed, as it were. So that's what we're going to do is in terms of hitting some of the highlights of up to uh, the idea of how parables work. The rest of the chapter on in this has this section on hearts being transformed, and I would say this just kind of as a side, where I have a little bit of a disagreement on how he interprets the Mark 7 passage here. This is the passage about um, where um, Jesus' disciples are being criticized for um, eating foods without washed hands. So these are the Pharisees who are raising this question because they have a tradition in which you're supposed to wash your hands so that you are eating food, ceremonially clean. He's noticing that the disciples are doing it. It's interesting that they're not noticing that Jesus doesn't do it, but it's the disciples. And then this gives an opportunity for Jesus to kind of talk about Pharisaic traditions, some of which he sees are done um, as human traditions that are taught as if they're God's commands, and they aren't God's commands. And sometimes some of Pharisaic traditions actually undercut God's commands. So he gives this illustration of the Korban rule. So where a person could sidetrack what they're supposed to give to their parents to take care of their aging parents, but instead hold that money, saying it's dedicated to God, and yet it's still staying in their possession. And so, in that way, that tradition that the Pharisees allowed for this money to be dedicated to God, to be kept in the person's possession and not being used for the care of the parents, is seen by Jesus um, as making null and void God's command to honor your mother and father. And then he talks about, so it's not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but what comes out of the mouth that defiles them. Now, I will say that in this saying, Jesus is not telling his disciples that it is okay to eat whatever that they want. He is not saying, as Wright makes one statement, that the purity rules in which Judaism thrived then, and for the most part thrives till today, are, he says, irrelevant. Jesus doesn't really think that they are irrelevant. Jesus is using what we call a relative negative, and when he says it's not what goes in, but it's what's come out, he's saying while food laws can make you ceremonially unclean, more serious uncleanliness is what kind of comes out of the heart. So these things of immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, those things make you unclean in a different and more serious way. Now, but I will say that in Mark's gospel, when Mark adds the little expression, thus all foods are clean, yes, Mark interprets it as saying for his readers, who are most likely Gentiles, that this saying means for them that the food laws, Jewish food laws, are not relevant for their participation in God's kingdom. But it's not the idea that, Jesus taught Jews that they can treat God's law of food purity as irrelevant. That would not have been the historical Jesus' intent. But it is Mark's intent to engage in a debate that's going on at the time that his gospel was written, to claim that what Jesus taught, in effect, means for Gentiles this. So overall, what Wright does say in this section, which I do agree with, is that when God becomes king, of course God is always king, but when God is demonstrated as king, he provides a cure for the uncleanness of hearts. And so that's what God is doing in the ministry of Jesus. He is finding a way, or he is providing a way where hearts are being made clean, and that is demonstrating his sovereignty over his people. And so that's part of hearts being transformed. And then the other thing that Wright will talk about is this concept about marriage when he talks about the divorce laws. And in this, he's got a quite an interesting way of reading the divorce teaching about Jesus, uh, when basically he thinks that the coming together of man and woman in marriage is this sign of belonging together of heaven and earth themselves, the integration of God's astonishingly variegated creation. So, so seeing a marriage as a reflection of what God is always intends for his relationship with human beings. So in the beginning, he has an Adam and Eve who come together, and their union is then kind of reflective of this kind of sovereignty of God working through humans over the earth. Well, of course, sin is brought in, and then, of course, that was rejecting God's sovereignty. And divorce is also this kind of breaking up of this a pair who are supposed to be reflective of God's sovereignty over creation. And so that's why Jesus is against divorce. He's against divorce because the original purpose, original plan is for a man and a woman to represent, as it were, God's sovereignty over creation. So it's a different, kind of a different way of reading it. I would say that, the one thing about all of this is there may be some political background in all of this, since we do have Herod Antipas, who has been involved in marrying his brother Philip's wife, and so there's a whole discussion about divorce and remarriage. And as it applies to Herod Antipas, may have been an issue. It may have been part of the trouble for John the Baptist, and why he ends up getting arrested and also in prison. Of course, for John the Baptist is probably bigger than that. It has to do with his preaching of the kingdom of God and suggesting that Herod Antipas's kingdom is not, God's kingdom. So he could have been seen as a revolutionist or an insurrectionist. Um, but but Jesus is kind of discouraging divorce. I would just say this about the language commits adultery. Jesus is talking like a prophet, and when he says commits adulteries, he's using language, very powerful language, to describe, in essence, the sinfulness of divorce that is done, in order to marry somebody else. So you divorce in order to marry somebody else. That's basically like that's adultery. That's sinful. Now there are, as Matthew's version of this indicates, there are legal grounds. Matthew provides the exception clause, that you can get divorced for lawful reasons, and but if a person gets divorced for unlawful reasons, they are divorced. It just wasn't for lawful reasons, and that too is sinful. So in that sense, it's kind of like adultery, which is another sin connected to marriage, that God disapproves of. So using adultery as this kind of metaphor for what happens when a person divorces with the intent of getting married, or for the purpose of getting married. So that is a little bit about the quick little review of that chapter 8, and some of the things that I would like for you to know and keep in mind.